Thank you. And I just shared my screen. Can everyone see that?
We can.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Alyssa Bettinger. I'm a senior planner with TRPA, and I was the project manager on the Phase 2 affordable and workforce housing amendments that our board adopted back in December of 2023. I'm going to keep this presentation relatively high level. I'm trying to keep it under 10 minutes to leave a bunch of time for questions. There's a lot of detail in these amendments, as I know many of you are aware of. So happy to dive into some of those details during the Q&A, and also if you want to set up a meeting with me to go over any of those following this meeting, I'm happy to do that as well. So first, I want to just give some context as to what these amendments were and how they kind of fit with the overall structure of TRPA. Back in 2020, our board agreed that housing was a priority and wanted to look at policy changes that TRPA could make or to reduce barriers to building affordable and workforce housing, specifically looking at what TRPA could do. So we launched a multi-year initiative that's now in the 5th year, and working with a working group that we have called the Tahoe Living Working Group. Some of you are part of that working group. That working group helped us prioritize our work into 3 sets of phases. The first phase, which we completed back in 2021, really focused on allowing and encouraging ADUs to be built in the basin, as well as looking at some incentives for converting old motels to long-term residential rental housing. Phase 2, which is the topic of the presentation today, was focused on development standards. And so those are the standards that we hold every building that is built in Tahoe to, and that influences the cost it takes to build a home. The next phase of our work is we have dubbed Cultivating Community, Conserving the Basin. This is also going to be a multi-year initiative that we have a great grant for, and we're currently working on now. But we're looking at some of our longer standing policies like our development rights and growth management systems, our mitigation fees, and really looking at how we can implement like a meaningful community engagement strategy, not only for this process, but for the agency moving forward. So this presentation is obviously focused on the Phase 2 housing amendments. Phase 2 again looked at our development standards, which are coverage, height, density, and parking. And when we start to sort of like design a house with these standards, we found that it's pretty easy to build a single family dwelling. But when you start to add more units, building multifamily gets pretty tough pretty quick. The parking is blank here, my apologies. It should say 4 spaces or 2 spaces per dwelling unit. So if you're building a duplex, it does require 2 spaces per dwelling unit. And so when there's 30% allowable coverage, and these specs are for kind of a typical flat lot in Tahoe outside of a town center, when you're allowed 30% coverage, that parking requirement eats into that coverage allowance pretty quick. And then height, we allow up to 36 feet with kind of a steeper roof pitch, as you can see in this photo here, which results in kind of an inefficient living space because the top floor, or there's just a lot of wasted space in the top floor, as well as it's just not as energy efficient. You're heating a top floor that is oftentimes not very usable. And then the density at 15 units per acre on a standard 5,000 square foot lot in the basin, you can't actually get more than 1 unit per our density allowances. And so that right there is kind of a no-go in terms of building multifamily housing. And so by looking at these standards, we really realized that we were incentivizing property owners to build larger single family homes, which are typically less affordable than our smaller multifamily duplex, triplex fourplex and even, larger scale multifamily development. And so unpacking this a little bit more, we worked with a consultant to start testing out different scenarios, um, to really understand what sort of tweaks we needed to make within the system and then what the results would be. And we found that allowing someone to utilize more of their property with higher coverage and reduced parking requirements, um, paired with allowing higher density, because in the example on the previous slide, it was kind of a non-starter with the density allowances on a typical lot size, um, and allowing more flexible roof pitch so there could be a more efficient building design. We found that all of those changes really reduce the cost to build, pretty significantly. And when costs to build are reduced, those savings can be passed on to the renters and buyers. We also recognize that we really want those savings to be passed on. I think we all know that not always those savings are passed on, and so the policy changes that our board adopted only apply to deed restricted housing. Um, and TRPA has a whole deed restriction program, where we use bonus units as incentives to build deed restricted housing. I'm not going to go into detail on that program in this presentation. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But I just want to note that there are, these changes do only apply. The changes that the board approved only do apply to deed restricted housing, and there is a limit with how many deed restricted bonus units we have remaining in our pool. So this isn't, these changes, I just want to give some context that these changes, were not approved for all residential development. It is just deed restricted housing. And then we also recognize that by allowing property owners and developers to utilize more of their lot will result in larger buildings, which is a concern for a lot of folks that live in the basin, property owners, that don't want giant houses right next door to them. And so we came up with two sets of policy changes. One is within town centers, and two is within um, our neighborhood or our residential neighborhoods that are adjacent to our town centers. So that's where we already allow for this multifamily housing, but our development standards make it really challenging. So the next couple slides, I'm just going to go through high level again of what the approved changes were by our board in each of those locations that I just mentioned. So in town centers, our board approved 9 additional feet of height for deed restricted housing. So currently we allow 4 stories of height in town centers, again, which are kind of like our commercial cores. So our board approved an additional story for those developments. They also approved higher coverage for deed restricted housing. So currently we allow up to 70% coverage. We didn't put a cap on the amount of coverage that could be utilized for deed restricted housing, partly because a lot of the parcels in our town centers are already 90 to 100% covered. And so we really wanted them to be able to utilize that additional coverage. I will say that since these changes have been adopted back in 2023, we have worked with a few or discussed with a few developers and Placer County staff, and we do have a requirement that in order to go above the coverage that we currently allow, right now the runoff has to be, or the property has to tie into a stormwater treatment system, and we are hearing that this is a very challenging requirement, and so this is going to take some time to actually get in place. And I just want to acknowledge that this is this is kind of the first step that we took in 2023, but there are more steps that are going to need to be taken to actually utilize this over time. Moving down to the third bullet, we did allow, our board approved higher density limits for deed restricted units. We're really trying to encourage those smaller units that are kind of affordable by design. And then reduced parking requirements. So a developer can come to us and show, through a parking study that this is the parking demand of my proposed development. and I'm either going to provide parking or contribute to transit or a number of other strategies that we can work with them on. There's not um, a strict requirement for a certain number of spaces because we know that it is very site dependent on how much parking needs to be applied, and we don't want to require more parking than is needed. And then outside of town centers, this is kind of moving into those residential areas that are adjacent to our town centers, where we do want to encourage higher density homes or higher density residential developments that support our commercial cores. And so the changes are, we did allow an increased building envelope, but the changes are sort of scaled to try to fit the scale of development that exists in those neighborhoods. So we are not allowing any additional height, but we are allowing a more flexible roof pitch. And so that hopefully it will result in a more efficient building design. We are allowing additional land coverage in these areas as well, with the same requirement that was on the previous slide. So the development has to tie into a stormwater treatment system, which in most places in the basin do not exist right now. And so again, we're going to be working with county staff and developers who want to build to try to build those systems out over time. We did raise density limits to really support those that's smaller scale multifamily. And then same thing with in town centers. Parking is going to be based on demand, not a strict requirement that exists like it does now. So implementation of the phase 2 amendments. I know that this is probably the source of most people's questions at this point. So we did, as I mentioned, our board approved this back in December of 2023. And they now have, the changes now have to be implemented into the local jurisdictions area plans. So local jurisdictions use area plans as their zoning document. And so right now, a lot of these standards like density and height, for example, are listed in both the TRPA code as well as the area plan, so the Tahoe Basin area plan for Placer County. And the changes, while they have gone into effect in the TRPA code, they don't technically go into effect until Placer County and TRPA amend the area plan to include those changes in both places. And so when we were going through the phase 2 process, we understood the challenge of implementing these changes. It took, a couple of years of working on this with a lot of input. They were very controversial amendments. We were litigated. It was very challenging. And given the experience that we went through and the experience that we've seen many other jurisdictions across the country go through when they're making these changes, we knew that it would be very difficult to leave it up to the local jurisdictions to adopt these, following our adoption. So we, as part of the changes that the board approved, they mandated that the local jurisdictions need to adopt these within 1 year, or TRPA can adopt them for the local jurisdiction. So that's kind of where we're at. It's been about a year since the policy changes took effect. It will be February 10th, technically. And so we gave the local jurisdictions 3 options. One is to opt in and adopt the changes as is. We also wanted to provide an option for the local jurisdictions to come up with alternative strategies that, incentivize and make or have a financial benefit to building deed restricted housing that potentially aren't the exact changes that we came up with. So that's kind of what we've been calling the opt-out strategy. And then the third option is that option that I just mentioned, that following a 1-year period, if the local jurisdictions have not amended their area plans, TRPA we do have a code provision where we can assume lead agency and adopt the amendments to the area plan on the local jurisdiction's behalf. And so right now TRPA is moving forward with that third option for the Tahoe Basin Area Plan, and we will be taking it to our Advisory Planning Commission next Wednesday on February 12th, and then our governing board on March 26th.